It's Wednesday here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. I've got Brooke, Pryor of ESPN, and I want to talk about how predictable the Steelers might be in this draft process versus other recent years where we've seen and kind of gotten an idea where they're going. That and a lot more here on their draft approach on the Locked On Steelers podcast. Let's get into it.
You are Locked On Steelers, your daily Pittsburgh Steelers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, welcome to the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter, bringing you your daily dose of all things in the Pittsburgh Steelers. As always, you can find the show on your favorite podcasting apps and on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoy it. Subscribe to this YouTube channel to get all of your daily Monday through Friday episodes, as well as our bonus content. We thank you for making us your first listen every day because we're your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by LinkedIn. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. As I said, we're joined by Brooke Pryor of ESPN. She's back on the show. It's been a minute, but Brooke, we're so glad to have you back. How have you been? Look like you've enjoying some nice weather out in North Carolina.
Oh, it's beautiful. I'm looking outside. I see my front porch right now. The sun is shining. I see breeze going through the trees. The leaves are rustling. I mean, it's a beautiful spring day. Other than the pollen and the allergies that come with it, you know.
that stuff be kicking my butt too. But let's talk about the Steelers and their draft approach right now, because you've been with the team at the combine, talking to Omar twice there. You were there at owners meetings where Mike Tomlin was dishing on where they see things in the draft and how they're looking at things. And it feels, at least to me, and I want to see if you agree with this, if this is one of the most unpredictable years the Steelers have had heading into the draft as far as who they're targeting. You think back to, a few years ago when they drafted Najee Harris. We all knew that Najee Harris was, if not the target, a major target for them, and they went and got him. You go back to last year, Broderick Jones was very much like someone that was very much on the radar that we had the sense they were going to get. Devin Bush, if you go back to 2019, it seems like they've kind of honed in on these guys in certain years. But this year, you could say that about some of the corners they've talked to, some of the tackles they've talked to, some of the centers they've talked to, even some of the receivers. It just feels like, to me, I have the least confidence about who exactly they're going to pick, and that might be an advantage to them versus when other GMs are looking at try to predict what they do.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, it's interesting because I was just talking on a podcast earlier today that it feels like the Steelers are predictable, but only in terms of the positions that they need. Right. It feels like they're much more focused, looking at the entire draft of the guys that they're bringing in. We know that they are, like, all of their top 30 visits have been offensive line and tackle, center, and then wide receivers, cornerbacks, and then they just brought in inside linebacker Peyton Wilson from NC State. I do know they really liked Peyton Wilson in the scouting process. They had guys at NC State's pro day. But it's interesting. I feel like that the Steelers are, you're right, they are predictable in terms of they're very focused on these positions, but as far as like specific targets, I have no idea. And I felt like this time a year ago, I mean, I went to Joey Porter Jr.'s pro day at Penn State a year ago because it was like, well, yeah, of course they're going to draft him somehow, some way. Like, that felt like a no-duh thing. Like, I remember I talked to Joey Porter Sr., I think back in like March or early April, working on like a pre-draft story, because you just kind of felt like that was going to happen. And Broderick Jones was a name that was mentioned a bunch. I don't think we knew the Steelers were going to end up moving up in the draft. But this year, it feels like, I mean, they could do anything within those positions and anything in terms of trading up, trading down. I think that they have intentionally set, I think, a bunch of smoke screens. I think they are very much canvassing all available options. And I think this is a really good draft class to have the needs that this team has. I mean, wide receivers are really deep. Centers are pretty deep. Tackles are deep. Corners, maybe not quite as deep, but I still think there's a lot of good guys on the board there that they can go after that, I think they have a lot of position flexibility and target flexibility no matter where they end up. I think it makes it fun. I also think it's going to make it really stressful while we're sitting in the Steelers media room waiting to see what happens, because we can't just sit back and relax and wait until, they get to pick 17 to sit up straight in our seats, because, I mean, shoot, last year they traded up to 14 Wouldn't shock me if they traded up or if they traded back and got more assets to fit some of those holes that they have.
I agree with that entirely. That's the thing, is that they could trade up to get their one guy at the tackle position or the cornerback or whoever that they think is just like, hey, we need to get this guy to add to start next year right now. Or they could trade back and say, you know what, that tackle class is really good this year, and we think we can get Amarius Mims at 25. You should trade back with the Packers, and then move up in the second round and try to get someone, get a guy like Zach Frazier or someone like that. And I think that's where it could be really interesting, is that you can lock in. Like, if you go back to, again, I brought this up a few times in the show over the past month or so, but you go back to 2016 when the team was very close to winning a Super Bowl. Like, they were on the cusp of, like, hey, they just need a little something over there. And everyone knew that little something was cornerback. And so the Bengals were able to get ahead of the Steelers and say, hey, we're going to take William Jackson III, and we're going to take the guy that the Steelers absolutely wanted. And so they ended up taking Artie Burns, and Artie Burns turned out to be one of the worst busts, of the Colbert era. And that, was a big hit on the Steelers, and a reason that they are. But now you have Omar Khan, and they have so many different directions. If you wanted to trade ahead for the Steelers, it's like a situation where, oh no, you took J.C. Latham, but you left Terrion Arnold on the board, or you're like, or no, you took Talisa Fuaga, or but Troy Fatanu's there, and it seems like there's enough options that if you're the Steelers, you don't have to be as aggressive this year to go up and get that pick. Where, like, last year, Broderick Jones felt like if you didn't get him, then you were going to be getting that second tier of offensive tackles or looking at another position entirely.
Yes, absolutely. I think that Omar Khan deserves a ton of credit for the deals that he's done in free agency. It kind of feels like Mike Tomlin gave him a wish list of, like, hey, here's all the guys that I want. Here's all the positions that we need to address. And I would be shocked if Omar Khan left any box unchecked. I mean, maybe finding a center in free agency, finding a corner in free agency. Those are the two, I think, most pressing things going into the draft. But I think that the way that they have approached free agency since the end of the season has really set up the draft nicely. And I think that it's almost a suggestion that the Steelers are changing the way that they do things, because in the past, it's felt like they wait until they get to the draft. And then it's, okay, we have got to nail this because we did not go after top dollar free agents. We didn't try to plug all these holes. Like, we felt like we could do that in the draft. And then it puts you in a position where, like, you have to be aggressive. Other teams know that you have to be aggressive, and you really telegraph a lot of moves versus now signing Patrick Queen, going out and getting Russell Wilson and Justin Fields. Like, they don't have to have anyone right now except center and corner. And I think both of those you can really, you can trade back. You can wait to the second round. They're deep classes. They also have to have a wide receiver, but they do have an insurance policy in Van Jefferson to be wide receiver too. Like, it's not like they're going to come out of the draft with absolutely no one. I think that, that they have set it up so that they have insurance policies for the positions of need that they have.
Absolutely. We'll go over more of those positions of need and weigh them as far as the importance, or at least what we think that they are looking harder at, versus offensive line at center and tackle versus skill positions like cornerback and wide receiver. All four of those positions could be the first round options there. All that here and more on the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter, with ESPN's Brooke Pryor. We'll be right back right after this. First, I want to remind you this show is brought to you by LinkedIn. Whether you're hiring for your small business or you want to find quality professionals that are right for the role, that's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help you find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. LinkedIn isn't just a job board. LinkedIn helps you hire professionals that you can't find anywhere else, even those who aren't actively searching for a new job but might be open to the perfect role. In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit other leading job sites. So if you're not looking on LinkedIn, you're looking in the wrong place. On LinkedIn, 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. Hire professionals like a professional, and that's with LinkedIn. LinkedIn knows that small businesses are wearing so many hats and might not have the time or resources to hire. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, I'm your host, Chris Carter, here with Brooke Pryor of ESPN. Brooke, I think one thing that's also really interesting is that at the owners' meetings, you were there when Mike Tomlin talked about, this Arthur Smith offense needs to be able to control the line of scrimmage. They want to be road graders. And he also talked about how this center class there's only a handful of centers that are plug and play type of guys in it. When you hear that, does that push against the idea that they could take a Cooper DeJean or Terran, like a corner in the first round, or a Brian Thomas at receiver in the first round? Because it seems like to me, if you want that to be your strength, you didn't add any offensive linemen in free agency. That's the position that you need to most hit her early and hit strong in this draft class.
100%. I mean, I think that the good news is that while the center class isn't especially deep, there are those plug and play guys. And I don't feel like there are a lot of teams ahead of the Steelers that would prioritize center above other positions. So I think that some really good value guys will fall to them at 20, or, they make a move, trade back, trade up, whatever. But I do think that because this team clearly wants to get back to the identity of running the football, of controlling the line of scrimmage, of everything is going to start with the run game. Everything is going to be predicated off of that. And we saw last year, Mason Cole, I really hate having to criticize his play because I really enjoyed him as a person. He was a great voice in the locker room, a really good leader, but his snaps were just not consistent. And there were so many times where it felt like this offense is right there in terms of the quarterback play is getting better with Mason Rudolph. Even Kenny Pickett had some moments, but just the snaps weren't consistent. He was putting the ball on the ground. And just in that situation where it felt like everything has to go right, when it starts going wrong with the guy that's snapping the ball, you could just see everything fall apart off of that.
Yeah.
It really underscored how important the position is. And the Steelers are not going to go into the regular season with Nate Herbig as a starting center. Like, that is not Nate Herbig's strength. His strength to me is in his versatility and his ability to be a depth guy, and he can be a plug and play guy anywhere in the interior, but you don't want to have to start him. Like, he's your relief pitcher. Like, bring him out of the bullpen like that. You have to get a center. And so I do think that has to be the priority, especially because the Steelers are much better at drafting, to me, receivers and DBs in the second round and later. I know the way the draft shook out last year, technically Joey Porter Jr. would be a first round pick.
Technically.
All of those things. But I just think they are so good at identifying guys with traits to be incredible wide receivers later in the draft. They're really good at getting those just diamonds in the rough type guys. And so I think because of that, you don't have to take a wide receiver in the first round. In fact, I would wait on it, especially Mike Tomlin talking about how deep this wide receiver class is because of the rise in 7-on-7 play and the way that sharpens their skill sets. The same can be said for DBs. I think that there's a correlation between deep wide receiver classes and deep corner classes. And I think that we're going to keep seeing more skilled wide receivers and cornerbacks as we get, later and later into the 2020s, which is a wild sentence, because of all of the 7-on-7 that's being played. I think that these guys really hone in those skills in terms of, ball defending, just their ability to guard these guys, the speed, some of those just technical things. They're repping it so much more often. And I think that it's going to make it maybe not easier to draft a corner, but I think that there's going to be more available at both of those positions.
I agree with you there, because that's the thing. There might be some people that say, well, they're not actually that good at developing. That's why they need these players. But you know what you say to that? Okay, even if they're not, these are the classes this year that are very deep, where you can get a guy like, you look at a guy like Malachi Corley. No one's saying Malachi Corley is in the top, is a first rounder in this class, but they're saying he might be second, maybe even third rounder guy. But there's a lot of people are saying, hey, he'll be a good number 2 wide receiver. People are comparing him to Deebo Samuels out there. And I think that's, if you can get a Deebo Samuel type receiver in the second or third round this year, you're doing all right. And you can, and that means you don't have to go and get the Brian Thomases, the Adonai Mitchells. Those would be certainly fun and exciting. But when you have other needs like center, like tackle, that allows you to kind of wait there. And then I know for people with defensive backs, people go over like, hey, the Steelers, they aren't good at drafting cornerbacks. They haven't drafted cornerbacks well, but Joey Porter Jr. looked pretty good. They, Cam Sutton, albeit, the recent things that happened with him in Detroit aside, he was a very good player that they drafted him. And I'll also remind people, this is a new front office. This Omar Khan, Andy Weidel, a lot of the scouts have been overturned. And so last year, this is a new track record for this organization scouting and picking all these positions. And last year, I think everyone can kind of agree across the board. Broderick Jones, Joey Porter Jr., Keanu Benton, Darnell Washington, Nick Herbig. That's a pretty good rookie class. We got to see how they develop. It's not saying that they're all going to become all-stars and Hall of Famers, but they had a very good first year as a rookie class. So maybe this front office has some advantages to it that we still haven't seen yet because we haven't seen enough drafts to say, okay, they're really good at picking this group like we did with the Kevin Colbert era.
And they have new coaches, new position coaches
too
in these areas. Grady is Grady Brown. My mind is just like, who are these guys? Who am I talking about? But he's still relatively new. And I think that he did a lot of great work with Joey Porter Jr. in terms of developing him. And there's still Corey Trice, who tore his ACL in training camp, similar body type. I'm excited to see what he can do. They also hired a new wide receivers coach who had a pretty good track record of developing guys with the Broncos, then was with the Jets. Their wide receivers have turned out pretty well, I would say. So I think that it's fair to look at the historical context of how this organization has drafted and the players that they've had success with in just terms of looking at the big picture. But I also think that you're right, because of the new people that are in charge that are making these decisions. I don't think that it means that everything should be panned or that you should only do things or they should only do things because of how it's been done in the past, because that's how an organization like the Steelers gets stuck at perpetually being above 500 by just continuing to lean on things from the past. You have to push forward. You have to do things differently and modernize. And they started doing that last year, even a couple of years ago, but last year, especially with that rookie class. And they really carried it through to this free agency by adding Russell Wilson and Justin Fields and Patrick Queen, trading away Deontay Johnson, getting Dante Jackson. I mean, I feel like this is a team that and an organization that is recognized we can't keep the status quo. Like the status quo is good enough to not have a losing season, but it's not good enough to go far in the playoffs, and you don't get a Lombardi trophy for not having a losing season. And we know that the Steelers measure their success in terms of playoff success, in terms of winning Super Bowls, and they just haven't done that recently. So by that measure, they haven't been successful doing the same old. So I think that they will shake it up.
I think so too. I think that it's another reason why I think that there should be confidence in people who are wondering about the Steelers, about will there be different lines there. I mean, if anything else, Brooke, you and I were there in Indianapolis for the Combine when it was somewhat sarcastically asked to Omar, like, "Oh, so you're interested in Russell Wilson?" Ha ha. And now he's a starting quarterback, and then Justin Fields, trade for Justin Fields. That's a joke, right? Now he's there. This is a whole new front office. There's a whole lot of different things here, and again, this goes back to my original question about them being less predictable, because all the things that you and I, and there's certain things that are traits that I think that will stand the test of time, like I'm looking really hard at players that the Steelers sent their top brass to for their pro day, players that they interviewed at the Combine and their top 30 visits. And I'm using that to hone in on guys like Nate Wiggins and Marius Mims, two guys that fit that exact category. But you know what? As far as people assuming that, they would never pick this position here, or, traditionally, you look at the Steelers' great players over the history, the one group on offense that they don't have like a super legend at is offensive tackle. And last year they drafted a guy in Broderick Jones in the first round to try to make him that. And I wouldn't be surprised if this year that's the move again there to try to beef up that position, because in today's NFL, you talk to all the major analysts that break down position by position, that's like one of the most important positions on the offensive line and on the offense as a whole. So to me, I think there's a whole new way of operating that locks in and says, hey, this group is operating at its own pace here. And we as journalists and them as you as fans out there, we're all still learning what their tendencies are because they're still just getting started.
Right, exactly. I think the only thing that you can predict with these Steelers this year is that they're going to be unpredictable.
Yes.
And I think that I don't think that we knew enough to say that last year in the draft because we didn't really know Omar Khan's tendencies, right? Like that was his first draft, making all the decisions as the GM. And so it was interesting to see how things unfolded in the Steelers. And he wheeled and dealed a lot, which is really fun. Like I was just talking on a podcast with a Steelers fan that's based in France. And he was saying that in the past, he would go to bed during the draft just expecting like, all right, well, we're probably going to pick this. Like, I'm excited, but I'm not really excited. And he said last year, like, he had to stay awake because right when he was about to go to bed, they trade up and draft Broderick Jones. And he was like, what? I didn't think that was going to happen. And so it feels very fresh and rejuvenated. I hope that is something that the Steelers continue through the fall because there are times when it feels like the organization is like a giant cruise ship that you're trying to turn around. Like it takes a lot of steam to really get it going and change direction. And there's a lot of moving parts. But it does feel like they are headed in a new direction. And that's really exciting. I mean, I've mentioned it a million times and I'm going to keep mentioning it because like you said, like we were all laughing when Omar was asked about like the Justin Fields and Russell Wilson, like, oh, you're going to go get Kirk Cousins too. Like, all of these jokes because it just seemed so far-fetched. And then things happen quickly. They're able to not just get one, but both. It really makes you think like, well, the sky's the limit in the draft, you know, no pressure, Omar, now that we're like building up all this stuff, like surprise, they're going to trade for the number 1 overall pick and get Caleb Williams. That would be wild. That I think you can probably take off the board. But anything else, you know, it's wide open.
Absolutely. I want to talk about who on the team right now might also be influencing their decisions, because I think that there's an aspect to leadership on this team that also plays into who they're going to prioritize in this draft. I'll talk about that more here in the Locked On Steelers podcast. Chris Carter with ESPN's Brooke Pryor. Stick with us. We'll be right back. But first, we'll remind you this show is also brought to you by Monopoly Go. I've been told I'm a really competitive person. And well, at time, all that stems back to my game nights back with my family growing up. We all had all our different board games and we play them for fun. But our Super Bowl was always Monopoly. Whenever I won that, it felt like I had a championship belt that I walked around with on my shoulder all week long throughout the house. Now, I can carry that championship belt around every day when I play Monopoly Go, an app that you got to download to your phone right now. It's the new mobile game that you can download right to your phone, and it's been downloaded over 150 million times. It's a new twist on Monopoly where you play on hundreds of different Monopoly boards in crazy locations, and you can even build up your own cities to bring in big money. The best part, I can still beat my family and friends and get that championship belt. Whether I charge them for rent for iconic Monopoly properties like Boardwalk, or I raid their vaults to get their money, all of my winnings can be shown on the Monopoly leaderboards when you download Monopoly Go. So get in the game and join your friends. Download Monopoly Go, now free on the App Store or Google Play. Back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, Chris Carter here with Brooke Pryor of ESPN. Brooke, I want to look at it from this perspective, because one thing I get the sense the Steelers really want to do, the Steelers really want to be able to make sure that they're bringing in guys who are not just going to be good players, but also leaders for the locker room moving forward. And that's something that they certainly have in certain positions. By the way, if you're listening to this and you're enjoying this conversation, go check out my North Shore Drive podcast. I talked to Ryan Shazier for today's episode. It's a really good one. He leads off the show. We talk about a lot of things Pittsburgh sports, but Ryan dips into the defensive leadership of the football. So go check that podcast out if you haven't already. But about Ryan Chase, about the leadership on the defensive side of the ball, it's kind of, we've seen the leaderships, TJ Watt, Minkah Fitzpatrick, Cam Hayward, they've been there. But this group kind of needs someone to develop like that on the offensive side of the ball. They were hoping it would be Kenny Pickett. That obviously didn't happen. But now you have young guys like Pat Freiermuth, Najee Harris, now Broderick Jones, who are on the team. And you can even throw on the defensive side of the ball, Joey Porter Jr. in the mix here. Who do you think in some of these positions are actually the future leaders of this franchise? Like when TJ Watt is at Cam Hayward's age, and when him and Minkah Fitzpatrick are starting to age out and Cam Hayward's retired and this team needs new people to look to. Are there anyone on this team right now that you feel like, hey, that's going to be the next guy who's like winning the Chief Award every other year.
I think that they really want it to be Najee Harris. I don't know. I'm interested to see how last year impacts him moving forward. And I mean, there's still the 5th-year option decision. At this point, I would expect them to pick that up. But I thought it was interesting that he was not a captain last year after being a captain the year before. And it really felt like the defensive guys, like Cam Hayward, was kind of pouring into Najee, and Mike Tomlin was spending extra time with him. So I think they really want it to be Najee, but at this point, I think it's up to Najee to take that role, because I think that this team is better when you have a guy that is kind of an outside the box thinker and not afraid to say things, whether internally or externally. I think you need someone that holds everyone accountable. But again, it's up to Najee if he is going to take that on and take it on all the time, not just when it suits him or when he feels like it. I think that someone like Pat Freiermuth is somebody that they want to turn to. I know during some of the offensive struggles, he was somebody that stood up in the team meetings and talked and really tried to rally guys around each other. I think Broderick Jones is someone that they would like to be a leader. I think that defensively, Joey Porter Jr., absolutely. Patrick Queen is another one that I think they need to see how he fits in the locker room, obviously, but he was essentially the Chief Award winner in Baltimore, their version of it last year. And it was funny, I was talking to a Baltimore beat writer about Patrick Queen, and she talked about how much she loved covering him, how respected he was in the locker room, him being the Chief Award winner there, their PFWA Media Good Guy Award. And I said, well, the guys that have been the Good Guy Awards in Pittsburgh the last couple of years have ended up getting cut. So hopefully we don't have that same track record with Patrick Queen. Landon Roberts is not a young guy, but I think that he also has the demeanor to be a leader. I think that I'm trying to think of some other guys that could be in that same vein. Maybe like Keanu Benton. It's tough because I do feel like some of the guys that they moved on from in this, like right before free agency, were some of the ones who had been leaders in terms of like Mason Cole, Patrick Peterson.
Yeah.
Those were big voices in that locker room. But I think it also just speaks to kind of the void of leadership that they have on the offensive side, that it's hard to see which direction they're going to go in, because I feel like I would have an easier time picking out guys who are not leaders than who are. Like, for example, I don't think that George Pickens is going to be the voice of the offense.
No.
That would be, talk about unpredictable. That would be
the biggest turn of like the decade. Like that'd be insane.
Exactly. I mean, it doesn't mean that he's not a good player. It doesn't mean he's not wildly talented, but he's not the guy that I think is going to rally everyone together. I think Miles Killebrew, for special teams and defense, is another big leader. But yeah, this team is so interesting because, I mean, like Jaylen Warren, obviously incredibly talented, really good player, really hard worker, but he's not a big voice. So I wouldn't pick him to be that guy. I think that a lot is going to be determined going forward through these OTAs. I mean, Russell Wilson, I think that's honestly why they brought Russell Wilson in, or one of the biggest things that was the most attractive to him as a player, is not only that he's a veteran, a Pro Bowler, won a Super Bowl, can help mentor Justin Fields, although they obviously signed him before trading for Justin Fields, but the fact that he has led a locker room before, or has embraced being a leader, obviously had mixed results. Things didn't end great in Seattle. Yeah. Rocky start in Denver. But I think that he has it in him to be a leader and to maybe also help identify who some of the other leaders can be in the locker room, especially on the offensive side. Like, they need a unifying voice, and they need someone who, even when his play isn't going well, will step up and motivate everyone else. And I think that that's something that, from what I heard out of Denver, when he got benched, he was still, I mean, the guy in the locker room that was on the practice or on the scout team, giving the defense all they could handle. He was helping prep the starting quarterback. Like, he was still being a leader without having an official title as a leader. So I think that's why they brought him in, to fill that void.
And that's something that that's a great observation. That's something that I've thought about on this show and thinking about, like, listen, like, part of what they need Russell Wilson to do is to reset culture. Like, with Kenny Pickett, they were hoping that, like, Mike Tomlin talked about it, like he loved the culture that Kenny Pickett had at Pitt. Kenny Pickett was part of the rise that Pitt had before this past year where they went 3-9, but he was a huge part of them winning an ACC championship and bringing in culture. Him and DeMar Hamlin were notably like how like the team really unified over those years. And, they were hoping that Kenny Pickett could work like that for the Steelers. Didn't work out. But now you're in a position where, like, look, at quarterback, you're doing a full reset. What about a guy who's literally done it in 2 different organizations? He's won playoff games. He's won a Super Bowl. He's been to another Super Bowl. He's been to 9 Pro Bowls. He's a guy who brings in respect with him. And it seems like, the defensive players especially seem to welcome him into the organization. And then you have a young guy in Justin Fields, who he was a leader at Ohio State. He was trying to figure that out at Chicago. That was a mess. And now he's got a new place. But now you have an older guy and a younger guy, both who have been leaders at some points in their careers, that they can do that at the quarterback position. And if this year's a year where they find out, hey, maybe Broderick Jones is a leader on the offense, maybe people get behind him, maybe Pat Freiermuth emerges as that guy at tight end, maybe Najee Harris gets voted as captain again, and he takes on a stronger role. But if you can even just hit on 2 of those guys, and then your quarterback situation, at least it has a solid head on it, and it's being led in the right direction. That's the kind of stuff that can reset your offense and allow you to say, okay, we're done with the Matt Canada, Randy Fichtner days where they were at the bottom of the league. Now the offense is respectable, and we can start building that in a way around this whole new core that we put together.
Exactly. And I also, listening to you talk about all the leaders, I realized I left out a big one on the defense in Minkah Fitzpatrick, which I think speaks to his leadership style. Like,
yep.
He's quiet, he keeps to himself. But when I was thinking about some of the things that went wrong on the offensive side and who was trying to keep those guys in check, it was Minkah Fitzpatrick who was over there after games talking about how he felt like guys weren't working hard and cared more about looking like a football player than being a football player. And I really hope that for the sake of this locker room, that Russell Wilson is able to do that, and Justin Fields too is able to give that, kind of translate some of that heat that the defense had been applying on the offense, and able to kind of internally spread it. Because I think when you're an offensive guy and you hear that from a defensive guy, you're like, come on, like, what do you know, kind of thing. It's more like, well, don't tell us what to do. Like, we're going to take care of it. Obviously you're on the same team, but it's still a different side of the ball. And I think that there is a disconnect there, that you maybe don't respect the advice or the criticism or whatever. It's harder to listen to when it's coming from the other side of the ball. You need somebody in your meetings, on, like, near you in the locker room, being the guy that says that. So I hope that is what, and I think the Steelers hope that that's what some of these guys that they're bringing in are going to be able to do.
Absolutely. She's Brooke Pryor of ESPN. Brooke, thanks so much for joining us here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. Let people know they can find you, follow you, and get more of your work.
You can find me on X at BE Pryor, and on ESPN.com under the NFL tab. You go to Steelers, all the good stuff is there.
Absolutely. She's Brooke Pryor. Thank you, Brooke, for joining us. And thank you for our listeners for joining us here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. You can find me, Chris Carter, on Twitter and Instagram at Carter Critiques. Read my work at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, post-gazette.com. And find me here on the Locked On Steelers podcast every day, Monday through Friday, bringing down your Pittsburgh Steelers. Remember, go check out the North Shore Drive podcast this Wednesday that features Ryan Shazier. When that's up, that's a very awesome conversation with a guy who did a lot of good things for the Steelers over the years. We're back tomorrow with more on your Pittsburgh Steelers right here on the Locked On Steelers podcast.